Hi, back in Austin. Hopefully you have gotten through the videos on the kind of syllabus stuff now, and so this video, and it might trail into another one, is sort of about the different subject matters that philosophy in general covers and about what ethics in particular covers. So this is just going to kind of give you some headlines that you can group different questions and thoughts under. There's no one right way to divide up philosophy into different subject matters, but here's kind of an ordinary way, is to divide it up into four different branches: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, which of course is going to be our focus, and logic. Metaphysics, which is the first big branch, asks the most abstract and deepest and most ultimate questions that can be asked. It will ask something like, what is it to be? And I don't even know what that question means, much less what the right answer to it. An easier to grip question that it will ask is, which things are? Of the things that someone might have imagined exist in the world, which of them really do? Does God exist? Are there souls? Are there minds? Is there freedom? Is anything true? Are there facts? Is there an external physical world? Well, all of these things have been argued about by various metaphysicians. A couple of more specific things that a lot of metaphysicians have argued about for a long time are the nature of the mind and the nature of freedom of the will. And these are a little bit relevant from our point of view. We're really interested in ethics. We don't care about the nature of the mind or freedom for their own sakes. But ethics has an awful lot to do with what we think that it is to be human. And what it is to be human, you might think, just is to have a mind and to have freedom of the will and a few other kind of related ideas. So if a mind turns out to be a brain, that would tell you a little bit of something about, what it is to be human. It would be to have a brain of a certain kind. If a mind is a set of behavioral dispositions, that would tell you what you are, your mind, so that you can be true to yourself. If the mind is something that's defined in a basically non-physical way, that would tell you something about how to understand yourself, and so what it would be to be true to yourself, to have integrity, to have ethics. Again, freedom could be any of many things. Freedom might be the ability to radically violate the laws of physics, or it might be something more mundane, like not being restricted by violence or brainwashing or something. What freedom and what mentality are is going to tell us something about what it is to be human, and what it is to be human is going to tell us something about how to behave. So we're going to have these concepts in the back of our minds at pretty much every point in the semester. The second big branch is epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. You could sort of say that it asks three big questions, which are, what is knowledge? Can we have any? And if so, how? So epistemology, massive, very complicated central branch of philosophy, which we're going to more or less set aside. We are going to assume that most of the stuff that we commonsensically think that we know, we're right. We do actually know them. So we will assume that by and large, when we look at things in the physical world around ourselves, we see them roughly correctly in general and as a rule. We'll assume that our memory is pretty reliable. We'll assume that science basically works. We'll assume that the testimony of other people is mostly pretty reliable, though of course we're going to have to be a little bit more cautious about that. We will at a few points have to solve some specific problems about moral epistemology. The weird thing about morality is that you might not be clear exactly what it is that you're talking about when you talk about morality. You say that someone has an obligation, but you can't observe the obligation. You can say that a certain action was morally good or morally bad, but you can't observe the moral goodness or moral badness. So it's not the kind of knowledge that you get from at least simple kinds of experience. It's not obvious how you would get it at all, or even how you could have it. At a few moments, we're going to have to try to figure out kind of how that works. But more or less, we're just going to say that our common sense works pretty well, and that's going to be kind of our big take on epistemology in this class. Another major branch is logic. Now this one you will actually have heard of. Logic is the study of good reasoning. It's not the study of how we actually reason. That's psychology. It's the study of how we ought to reason. Logic sort of sits in a way between epistemology and ethics. On the one hand, since logic has to do with evidence, inference, proof, argumentation, things like that, you would think that it would have to do with knowledge and justification, and that, of course, is what epistemology studies. But on the other hand, logic tells you what your obligations and what your permissions are when it comes to believing things. It actually tells you what you have a certain kind of right to believe and a certain kind of obligation to believe. So in that sense, it's a little bit like ethics. We can say specifically that these kind of logical rights and obligations that we have to do with implications and contradictions. If you want to have a certain conviction or belief or judgment, that's fine, but logic might tell you that you're obligated to have other convictions, judgments, or beliefs, the ones that are implied by the first thing that you wanted to believe, in much the same way that if you're going to drive a car, you're obligated to keep insurance on that car. You didn't have to have the car in the first place, but if you're going to have the car, you're going to have to keep insurance on it. So if you want to believe that Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then you're obligated to believe what's implied by those claims, which is that Socrates is mortal. And likewise, you don't get to believe two claims that contradict one another. If there are two claims that cannot possibly both be true, you don't really have much in the way of a logical right to accept both of them. In just the same way that you have a right to marry a person, and you also have a right to marry another person, but you don't have the right to marry both of them, you can have the right to believe that a certain policy is a good idea, and you have the right to believe that a certain policy is not a good idea, but you don't have the right to believe that it is both a good idea and not a good idea. Logic won't tell you what's true and it won't tell you what's false. But given that you have assumed that something is true, either because you actually believe it or because it's a speculation that you're trying to test, it will tell you what else must be true, and it will tell you what must be false if that initial claim is true. So logic will tell you what those implications and contradictories are. So it will tell you what you do and do not have a right to believe and what you do and don't have an obligation to believe given the beliefs that you have. We're going to struggle to be logical in this class, but we're not going to make an explicit study of logic. As with epistemology, we're going to be kind of commonsensical about our logic. Last big branch, most important one for us, of course, is ethics. What exactly ethics studies is maybe a little unclear, but it definitely asks the question, what should I do? To get a better grip on the nature of ethics, we can break it down into three sub-branches: metaethics, ethical theory, and applied ethics. Metaethics doesn't ask questions directly about what we ought to do. Metaethics asks about the nature and the meaning and the justification of moral and ethical claims. So for instance, let's say that I come to a practical decision. I decide that I ought to do so-and-so. Well, what is this ought-to-do relationship between me and so-and-so? I mean, we can get a grip on what you mean if you say X is to the left of Y or something like that, but what is this ought-to-do-it relationship? What have I been talking about when I said that I ought to do something? Another important metaethical question will involve the nature, the application of the concept of truth to moral claims. Are any moral claims true? Some metaethicists have said that no moral claim is either true or false, that they're just not the right kind of thing to assert facts or try to describe the world. Some metaethicists have said, yeah, they're true or false, but they're all false. Every moral claim, according to this school of thought, is false, because they all will have to attribute some kind of ethical quality to something, and nothing has any ethical qualities at all. The world is exhausted by physical objects, physical events, physical fields of force, describable in physical terms, and ethics isn't physics, so there's just no such thing as ethics. Other metaethicists have wanted to say that moral claims are true, or they can be true or false, but they're true or false in a strange way, as distinct from an ordinary claim like 2 + 2 is 4, or the sky is blue, or something like that, which are just up and true or false, period. Moral claims are true or false depending on who says them. So for one person, say, group marriage is true, whereas for another, the claim that group marriage is good is true, whereas for another person, the claim that group marriage is good is false. So we can say that the two different moral claims are true or false for different people. We're going to take a quick look at a few of those options. Another subject in metaethics is what you could call moral epistemology. How would you have knowledge of moral claims? Even assuming that we can agree that there are such things as true moral claims, it still might be that we couldn't figure out which of the moral claims are true. Specifically, moral claims and ethical claims don't seem to be the kinds of things that you can prove on the basis of observation or physical evidence or experience of any kind. So how is it that we would know that they're true? Do we have some sort of a magical internal intuition, or do we have some kind of common sense, or do we have to learn them? And if we have to learn them, then what could possibly teach us these claims? A last metaethical issue that I want to mention, because it's going to be kind of important to us, has to do with the different importance of moral judgments at different levels of abstraction. You can say that there are very abstract moral claims, like you should be honest or you shouldn't tell lies or something like that. We can call those general moral principles. And there are also much less abstract moral judgments. You should be honest to your wife, or you should not lie to your little brother, or something like that. So some philosophers called particularists think that we really have very little scope for general moral principles, whereas other philosophers called generalists think that general moral principles do an awful lot of work for us in our moral deliberations. So that's going to be an issue that we need to address at least briefly before we can get started in on ethics proper. The second main sub-branch of ethics is ethical theory. Depending on your preferred ethical theory is going to attempt to describe the most fundamental moral or ethical concept that there is, and that is going to be probably either the concept of the good or the concept of the right. Ethical theory is going to try to specify general principles that should govern me, or should govern one, in all of one's actions. They're going to be very abstract, not very particular. They're going to belong to some kind of a general theory, which is why it would be called ethical theory. And the last main branch of ethics is applied ethics, which is our actual topic for the class. Unlike ethical theory, that tries to give very abstract moral advice, applied ethics tries to give much less abstract, much more particular moral advice. It's going to have to do with specific recurring kinds of morally problematic situations that you can find yourself in, where the idea is to do some of the work in advance, in a little bit the abstract, of reasoning through particular problems that you're going to find yourself in. Applied ethics is going to have about as many branches as you can think of interesting moral situations. So for instance, 3 branches of applied ethics are business ethics, sexual ethics, and technological ethics, which are going to try to give some advice about recurring moral problems having to do with business and labor and sex and sexuality and technology and our technological interactions with other people. That, of course, is roughly what our class is supposed to be about. And then there are many other branches of applied ethics. There's medical ethics, engineering ethics, legal ethics. Medical ethics, just to pick an example, would have to do with giving doctors sort of advanced advice, suggestions, rules of thumb about how to deal with specific situations involving consent and honesty, end-of-life care and euthanasia, just how to deal with patients, how to understand your medical relationship to patients. Legal ethics, how to understand your relationship with clients, justice, people on the other side of a legal case, things like that. We're not really going to touch on most of those, but hopefully this has given you a sense for what the general questions are that philosophy asks, and a little bit of just sort of some headlines and signs to mark out the territory of ethics. Next video is going to be about some of the major issues in metaethics that we need to say something about before we can start trying to answer ethical questions.